All right, get ready for today's deep dive because we're
Yeah.
going deep into a congressional hearing
Oh, yeah.
on domestic terrorism,
Uh-huh.
specifically white nationalism.
Yeah.
You sent me some pretty intense material for this one.
Definitely not light reading.
No. Expert testimonies, heated debates, the whole 9 yards.
The whole works.
It seems like these folks can't even agree on what the problem is.
Well, you've got so many voices in this hearing, and yeah, they don't exactly see eye to eye on much of anything.
Yeah,
It's almost like even defining the problem is a minefield.
it is.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? It's like a microcosm of the larger conversation that's happening,
Exactly.
in our society.
Yeah.
We're not just going to be looking at what people are saying, but why? Why are they saying these things?
Okay, so to set the stage for our listeners,
Okay.
this hearing was called to look into the threat of white nationalism and domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And we're hearing from a whole bunch of expert witnesses, including some people from the Anti-Defamation League.
Yes.
ADL,
The ADL.
they track hate
Wow.
groups and extremist activity.
Right. And here's where things get interesting, right? Because the hearing itself actually becomes part of the story. Who called this hearing? Who picked the witnesses? This stuff really shapes how the whole conversation unfolds.
All right, I'm starting to see how all of this connects.
Yeah.
One of the most explosive parts, at least for me, was when Candace Owens, the conservative commentator, she testified.
Yes.
And she flat out says that white supremacy is not a major threat to Black America.
Yeah, she ranks it way down on her list of concerns.
Like way down.
Which, as you might imagine, sparks a lot of pushback, a lot of fireworks.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Other folks jumped in right away.
Yeah.
Pointing to real-world violence, they say, look, we need hard data to understand just how big this problem is.
Sure.
And then, of course, Owens's past comments about Hitler and nationalism come under scrutiny.
Hold on, wait, time out for a second.
Okay.
I'm a little lost.
Yeah.
If there's no data,
Yeah.
how can anyone say white nationalism, IS, or isn't a big problem?
That is the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and that's where the debate gets really, really interesting.
Okay.
A big chunk of this hearing is about data, or more accurately, the lack of data.
Okay.
Owens claims there are no numbers to back up the idea that white nationalism is a significant threat.
But how is that even possible? I mean, don't they track this kind of thing?
Well, that's exactly what they're fighting about.
Okay.
This whole thing throws a spotlight on how data on domestic terrorism is collected,
Mm-hmm.
but even more importantly, how it's interpreted, right? And you start to see how political priorities can influence the research, which is a little unsettling, no?
It is, kind of. Like,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder what we don't know.
Right.
Because of how information is collected and then prioritized.
Yeah.
So is everyone just making things up then?
Yeah.
Or what are they basing their arguments on?
Well, one witness brings up a fascinating point about the lack of concrete data.
Right.
It actually goes way back. They draw a parallel to the FBI's COINTELPRO program from the 60s.
COINTELPRO vaguely rings a bell.
You remember that one?
Refresh my memory.
So COINTELPRO, this was a covert FBI program aimed at disrupting and discrediting groups that were seen as subversive.
Okay.
And while they did infiltrate Klan groups, there was a much heavier focus on disrupting leftist and activist groups, especially those of color.
So basically, they decided who to spy on based on their own biases.
That's the argument, yeah.
Wow.
And the point this witness is making is that the lack of comprehensive data on white nationalist threats today, it's a direct result of where resources and attention have been focused historically.
Wow, so you're saying that past surveillance practices are actually contributing to the lack of data on white nationalist groups today?
Exactly.
Or making it harder to accurately assess the threat?
Precisely.
That's crazy.
And that brings up a huge question for all of us. How do we make sure that the way we collect data on a topic as sensitive as this, how do we make sure it's objective and unbiased?
That's a really good point, especially when it's so politically charged.
Especially when it's so politically charged.
Okay, so we've got this big clash over data,
Mm-hmm.
but the hearing does eventually try to come up with some solutions, right? They don't just argue the whole time.
They do try to move toward solutions.
Okay.
One expert suggests increasing funding for something called the Department of Homeland Security's Nonprofit Security Grant Program.
Okay. In plain English, what's that?
Basically, it provides money to help nonprofits, including religious institutions, to improve their security measures.
Ah, so like installing cameras, reinforcing doors, maybe even hiring security personnel.
Exactly.
Okay, so connecting the dots, are they saying this grant program could help protect places like synagogues and mosques, places that have been targets of hate crimes.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
But then, of course, this brings up questions about the government's role in protecting religious institutions.
Right, that whole separation of church and state thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because if the government is funding security for religious institutions, does that blur the lines a bit?
Right.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle,
Yes.
The hearing also highlights the Community Relations Service.
Okay.
It's this peacemaking office within the Justice Department.
What do they do?
They act as mediators in communities dealing with hate incidents,
Oh, interesting.
trying to resolve conflicts and keep things from boiling over.
So like a last resort kind of thing.
Yeah.
When things are already tense.
Not necessarily, They can do preventative work, too,
Okay.
providing training and resources to community,
Yeah, that's good.
helping them address these issues proactively.
Got it. So even when they're talking solutions, it sounds like there's still a lot of tension in the room.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that Candace Owens accused someone of trying to manipulate the narrative.
Right.
What happened there?
Well, Owens claimed that a clip of her earlier comments about Hitler had been taken out of context
Oh.
to make her look bad,
Okay.
basically painting her as a Nazi sympathizer.
Ugh, that's such a classic example of how a soundbite can be totally twisted.
It is.
It's like taking one sentence from a book and saying, see, this is what the whole book's about.
Exactly, and it highlights why critical thinking and media literacy are so important these days.
Especially in this day and age,
Actually, now, yeah.
where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Absolutely.
So who exactly was doing the manipulating? Give me the details.
Okay, so during the hearing, a Democratic representative played this clip of Owens's previous comments about Hitler, focusing on this one little part where she says, and I quote, "If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine."
Yikes.
Right. And he used this
Yeah.
to suggest that she was sympathetic to Hitler,
Wow.
which she vehemently denied.
So she's saying he cherry-picked her words to twist her meaning?
Exactly. Owens argued that the clip was taken out of context and that her full comments made it clear she wasn't defending Hitler.
This is something we see all the time in the media.
All the time.
It's a tactic, and it's something we, as consumers of information, have to be really aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good reminder to always look at the full context before you jump to conclusions about someone's views.
Yeah.
So, listener, what do you think about this? How do we even navigate these debates
That's tough.
and figure out the truth when we're constantly hit with conflicting information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
I think we have to be critical thinkers, and we have to be willing to do the work,
Yeah.
to research, understand the nuances of these issues.
Right. We can't just take everything we hear at face value.
Exactly. Especially not when it comes to emotionally charged topics like this, like domestic terrorism. It's about being discerning, asking ourselves, who benefits from this narrative?
Yeah.
What are the agendas at play here?
And being open to different perspectives, even when they make us uncomfortable.
That's right. We may not always agree, but we can learn from each other by having respectful dialogue.
For sure.
And remember, this is just a snapshot of much bigger conversation.
Right.
This debate about domestic terrorism and white nationalism, it's ongoing, and the stakes are high for all of us.
Absolutely. This stuff affects everyone.
Absolutely. And what we've seen in this hearing is just the tip of the iceberg, There's so much more to explore, and I encourage you to keep digging. Do your own deep dive into this complex issue.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
Absolutely.
And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to issues that affect us all.
I love that. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Glad you liked it.
Now, before we move on,
Okay.
I want to circle back to Candace Owens for a minute.
Yeah.
Putting aside all the controversy, she did bring up some interesting points about the things she thinks are the biggest problems facing Black America.
She did. She argued that issues like father absence, problems with the education system, and illegal immigration are all much bigger threats than white supremacy.
Okay.
Which is interesting, right? It challenges that dominant narrative that always seems to focus solely on white nationalism as the primary threat to minority communities.
It's a good reminder that there are lots of different perspectives on this, and that different communities have widely varying lived experiences.
Yeah, and it raises questions about how we decide what to prioritize and how we address the different problems facing our society.
Right. Like, how do we make sure we're dealing with the most urgent issues for all communities, not just the ones that get the most media attention?
Exactly. It all comes back to critical thinking and considering multiple perspectives.
Hmm.
We can't rely on headlines and sound bites to understand these complicated issues.
Right. And we need to be careful about how political agendas and media narratives can shape our perceptions,
Absolutely.
like we saw with that whole Hitler clip incident.
Yeah. It's a constant process of learning, questioning, and seeking out the truth.
For sure.
We can't afford to just passively consume information.
Right.
We need to be active participants in shaping the narratives that define our world.
So, listener, what resonated with you in this deep dive? What questions does this raise for you about the threat of domestic terrorism? About the role of political narratives? About the importance of critical thinking?
We encourage you to think about these questions and keep exploring this complicated issue. Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
It is.
It's up to each of us to stay informed,
Yes.
stay engaged, and stay committed to building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Absolutely.
For everyone. They try to, resolve conflicts, keep things from getting out of hand.
So they're kind of like the folks you call when things are already pretty tense.
Yeah, but not necessarily always like a last resort.
Okay.
Sometimes they do preventative work, too.
Got it.
Like providing training and resources
Oh.
to communities to help them, address these issues before they blow up.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So even when we're talking about solutions, it sounds like the whole hearing was still super tense.
Oh, yeah, there was definitely tension in the room.
You mentioned earlier that Candace Owens accused someone of trying to manipulate the narrative.
Right.
What was that all about?
Well, Owens claimed that a clip of some earlier comments she made about Hitler
Uh-oh.
was taken out of context
Right.
to make her look bad.
Right.
Basically, they were trying to paint her as a Nazi sympathizer.
That's rough. I mean, talk about weaponizing a soundbite.
Totally, right? It's like taking a single sentence from a whole book and
Right.
saying, see, this is what the entire book's about. It's
Exactly.
just not an accurate representation.
It's not. And it shows why critical thinking and media literacy are so important,
so important, yeah.
especially nowadays.
Especially these days when we're bombarded with information from every direction.
Okay, so who exactly was doing the manipulating here? Give me the details.
All right, so during the hearing, a Democratic representative played this clip
Okay.
of Owens's earlier comments about Hitler, and they zeroed in on this one part where she says, and I quote, "If Hitler just wanted to make Germany great and have things run well, okay, fine."
Yikes.
Yeah. And he used this to suggest that she was sympathetic to Hitler,
Wow.
which Owens absolutely denied.
So she's saying that they, cherry-picked her words, twisted her meaning?
Exactly. Owens argued that the clip was taken out of context and that if you heard the whole thing, it was clear she wasn't defending Hitler.
This is something we see all the time in the media, though.
Oh, all the time.
It's a tactic. And we as consumers of information, we got to be aware of it.
We do. We have to be really careful.
It's a good reminder to always engage with the full context,
Mm-hmm.
before you jump to conclusions about what someone believes.
Exactly.
So, listener, what do you think about this? How do we navigate these really complex debates?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, and how do we even figure out the truth when we're constantly being hit with all this conflicting information?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's tough out there.
It is?
I think we have to be really critical thinkers.
Yeah,
We have to be willing to do the work.
the research.
Yeah, research. Understand the nuances
Mhm.
of these issues.
Right, like we can't just accept everything we hear as fact.
Right. Especially not when it comes to such emotionally charged topics like
Right.
domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
We need to be discerning, Ask ourselves who benefits from this narrative.
Yeah.
What are the agendas at play here?
Mm-hmm. And be open to different perspectives, even when they make us uncomfortable.
Right. And you know what? We might not always agree,
Of course.
but we can learn from each other
For sure.
by engaging in respectful dialogue.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that this is just one little piece
Yeah, a snapshot
of a much larger conversation.
of a much larger conversation. This whole debate about domestic terrorism and white nationalism, it's far from over.
It is. And the stakes are high for everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, this affects all of us.
It does. It affects all of it.
And honestly, what we've seen in this hearing is just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow.
I encourage you to keep digging, do your own deep dive into this really complex
This
issue.
is a lot to process.
It is. But keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
I love that.
And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to issues that affect all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to Candace Owens for a second.
Okay.
You know, all the controversy aside, she did bring up some interesting points about the things she believes are the biggest threats to Black America.
Right. She argued that things like father absence, problems with the education system and illegal immigration, she said these are all much bigger threats than white supremacy. Which is really interesting because it kind of challenges that dominant narrative that always seems to focus solely on white nationalism as the main threat to minority communities.
Yeah, it is a good reminder that there are lots of different perspectives and that different communities have very different lived experiences.
Absolutely. And it raises a lot of questions about how we prioritize.
Right.
How we address all the different problems our society faces.
Exactly. Like, how do we make sure we're tackling the most urgent issues for all communities, not just the ones that get the most airtime on the news?
Right. It all comes back to critical thinking and considering all those different perspectives.
For sure. We can't just rely on headlines and sound bites
No,
to understand these complicated issues.
We need to engage with diverse voices, challenge our own assumptions.
And be aware of how political agendas and the media can shape what we think.
Absolutely.
Like we saw with that whole Hitler clip thing.
Right. It's a constant process of learning, questioning, searching for the truth.
We can't just passively take in information,
Right.
We got to be active participants in shaping the stories that define our world.
So, listener, what really hit home for you in this deep dive? What questions do you have about the threat of domestic terrorism, the role of all these political narratives, and how important critical thinking is?
We encourage you to think about all this and keep exploring this really complicated issue. This is just the start of the conversation, It's up to each of us to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay committed to building a more just and equitable society.
For everyone.
For absolutely everyone.
And it's important to remember that Owens, despite raising some of those points, she's also been accused of using inflammatory rhetoric herself.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, her comments about Hitler and nationalism,
right,
even if they were taken out of context, they definitely raised some eyebrows.
For sure.
And then you have her focus on issues like father absence and illegal immigration.
Some people see that as a way to distract from white supremacy.
It's a good reminder that even when someone challenges the mainstream narrative, they might still be promoting harmful ideas.
Exactly, whether they intend to or not.
Right.
It's so important to be critical of everything we hear, not just the things we disagree with.
Yeah.
We need to really think about what people are saying and the potential impact their words might have.
Words have power.
Right.
They can inspire and uplift.
For sure.
But they can also be used to divide and spread hate.
Absolutely. And we have to be so mindful of that,
Right.
especially when we're talking about sensitive topics like this.
This deep dive has really shown how complicated this whole debate is.
It really has. It's not a black and white issue.
No.
There are so many perspectives, conflicting data, strong emotions.
Yeah.
And it's all tangled up with race, identity, and power dynamics.
So where does that leave us? What are our listeners supposed to take away from all this?
Well, as you continue to explore this topic, I'd say approach it with an open mind, but also a critical eye. Okay.
Don't shy away from those gray areas, even when they make you uncomfortable.
It's tough, but important.
It is. Fighting extremism requires all of us to stay vigilant, informed, and engaged. We all have a part to play in creating a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground today.
We did. From historical context to politics, real-world policy, we even talked about how powerful words and information can be.
It was quite the deep dive, and like you said, we've only scratched the surface.
Barely scratched the surface.
So, listener, what are your big takeaways from all of this? What questions do you have about how we as a society define and address extremism? Remember, knowledge is power, and that's especially true when it comes to complex and challenging issues like this one.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and stay informed.
Until next time.